Kunigunde of Habsburg was born at the very heart of European power. She was an emperor's daughter, a duchess by marriage, and the mother of future rulers. Yet history remembers her not for conquest or command, but for what she lost. One child, then another, then the man beside her. When everything that tied her to the world was gone, she did not fight to stay in it. She simply walked away. Kunigunde of Habsburg was born in 1465 into one of the most powerful dynasties Europe had ever produced. Her father was Frederick III, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, a man whose authority stretched across fragmented lands, bound together more by tradition than unity. Her mother, Eleanor of Portugal, brought Iberian royal blood into the Habsburg line, reinforcing the dynasty's reach through marriage rather than conquest. From her first breath, Kunigunde's existence was already meaningful to others, not for who she was, but for what she represented. In the 15th century Habsburg world, daughters were not raised as individuals. They were raised as future decisions. Every lesson, every ritual, every expectation surrounding Kunigunde's childhood was shaped by a single assumption. Her body and name would one day secure political stability. Love was irrelevant. Preference was dangerous. Choice was unnecessary. A Habsburg daughter was valuable precisely because she could be exchanged. Kunigunde grew up in a court defined by restraint and calculation. Her father, Frederick III, was famously cautious, suspicious of bold gestures, and deeply concerned with preserving dynastic control. His children were raised within this atmosphere of deliberate emotional distance. Affection existed, but it was disciplined. Warmth was permitted only insofar as it did not interfere with duty. Kunigunde learned early that silence was safer than expression, obedience more useful than desire. Her education reflected this purpose. She was taught languages, religious devotion, court etiquette, and the subtle arts of diplomacy expected of a noble woman. Yet she was never trained to rule, command, or decide. Her knowledge was meant to support men in power, not replace them. Even intelligence in a woman of her position was to be displayed carefully, never too boldly, never in a way that suggested independence. Marriage hovered over her childhood like a shadow cast long before sunset. Potential alliances were discussed while she was still young, not as conversations about her future happiness, but as negotiations between territories. Each possibility represented not a husband, but a shift in the balance of power. Kunigunde herself was not consulted, because consultation implied agency, and agency was not part of her role. This absence of choice was not experienced as cruelty in the modern sense. It was simply reality. Kunigunde did not grow up believing she had been deprived of something, because she was never told she possessed it in the first place. Desire was not suppressed. It was never allowed to form. Her world did not ask her what she wanted. It asked only whether she would comply. Religion reinforced this worldview. Piety was not merely spiritual, it was political. Obedience to God mirrored obedience to dynasty. Suffering was framed as virtue. Endurance was praised more than joy. For Kunigunde, faith did not offer escape from her predetermined path. It taught her how to walk it without complaint. As she matured, Kunigunde became increasingly aware that her value lay in her potential to be transferred elsewhere. She was treated with respect, but also with a certain distance reserved for objects not yet deployed. Her presence was protected, monitored, preserved, like something awaiting use. Even affection from family members carried the unspoken understanding that her life would eventually belong to another court. Unlike male heirs, Kunigunde had no future in which her name alone would command authority. She would leave the Habsburg court not as a representative, but as a concession. Her success would be measured not by her happiness, but by the stability she helped create elsewhere. If conflict followed her marriage, it would be endured. If loneliness accompanied it, that too would be considered acceptable. There is little evidence that Kunigunde resisted this fate in her youth. Not because she lacked spirit, but because resistance required a language she had never been taught. To object, one first had to imagine an alternative. Kunigunde was never shown one. This is the quiet tragedy at the heart of her beginning. She was born powerful, surrounded by symbols of authority, yet denied the most basic form of power, the right to choose the shape of her own life. Long before she lost children, before she lost her husband, before she chose silence and withdrawal, Kunigunde had already been surrendered, gently, completely, and without protest, to the expectations of her dynasty. Everything that would later be taken from her was first withheld here. By the time Kunigunde of Habsburg reached marriageable age, her fate had already narrowed to a small number of acceptable outcomes. Every possible match was weighed not in terms of compatibility, but consequence. Who would gain territory? Who would lose influence? Who would stand closer to, or farther from, the imperial center? In this world, marriage was not a personal transition. It was a political event capable of altering borders. The man chosen for Kunigunde was Albert IV of Bavaria, a member of the powerful Wittelsbach dynasty and ruler of Bavaria Munich. On paper, the union made sense. It connected two of the most influential houses in the Holy Roman Empire. But beneath that logic lay fear, especially from one man. Kunigunde's father, Frederick III, opposed the marriage fiercely. Frederick III was not a ruler who feared many things openly, but he feared imbalance. He had spent his reign attempting to hold together a fragile imperial structure through patience, delay, and caution. To him, Bavaria, strengthened by direct Habsburg blood, represented a threat, an autonomous power bloc that might one day rival imperial authority rather than support it. A Habsburg daughter married into Bavaria was not merely a bride. She was leverage handed over permanently. For months, negotiations stalled. Objections were raised. Conditions were imposed. Frederick attempted to slow or prevent the union through bureaucratic pressure and diplomatic resistance. But Kunigunde's position became increasingly precarious. Once her engagement to Albert was publicly known, withdrawal became almost impossible. To cancel the marriage would be to insult Bavaria, undermine Habsburg credibility, and place Kunigunde herself in political limbo. Damaged goods in dynastic terms. In the end, Frederick relented. Not because his concerns were resolved, but because the cost of refusal had grown too high. In 1487, Kunigunde married Albert IV. The wedding did not symbolize harmony. It marked compromise under pressure. From the beginning, Kunigunde entered her marriage under the weight of unresolved hostility. She was not sent to Bavaria as a cherished bridge between dynasties, but as the visible reminder of a conflict that had never been fully settled. Her presence carried meaning she did not choose and could not shed. As Duchess of Bavaria, Kunigunde's role was tightly defined. She was expected to legitimize Albert's rule, produce heirs, and represent stability. Yet her very existence at court was layered with contradiction. To some, she was a valuable link to imperial authority. To others, she embodied external interference, Habsburg blood in Wittelsbach territory. There is little evidence that Kunigunde entered this marriage with romantic expectations. By the standards of her upbringing, marriage was an obligation to be fulfilled with discipline, not anticipation. Still, the emotional landscape she stepped into was colder than most. Albert IV was a capable ruler, focused on consolidating power and stabilizing his duchy. His priorities lay in governance, succession, and maintaining authority over often fractious Bavarian lands. Kunigunde was not invited into these concerns as a partner. She was part of the structure supporting them, not a voice shaping them. This imbalance was not unusual. What made Kunigunde's situation distinctive was the tension surrounding her very legitimacy as duchess. She had arrived with her father's reluctant consent, not his blessing. That absence echoed quietly through her married life. At court, Kunigunde learned restraint anew. She observed carefully, spoke sparingly, and avoided displays that might provoke suspicion or resentment. Any misstep risked being interpreted not as personal error, but as Habsburg arrogance. Her behavior was not merely scrutinized, it was symbolically loaded. Marriage did not free her from her dynastic identity, it intensified it. Even private moments were shaped by political consequence. Her value within the marriage was tied closely to what she could provide. Heirs, sons especially, were essential. Not only to secure Albert's line, but to justify the marriage itself in the eyes of those who had opposed it. Motherhood was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. Kunigunde adapted as she had been trained to do. She did not challenge the structure of her marriage. She did not seek influence through intrigue. She did not attempt to soften her husband's authority with her own. Instead, she fulfilled her role with quiet diligence, allowing time and continuity to validate her presence. Yet beneath that surface compliance lay a subtle isolation. Kunigunde had left behind her childhood court only to enter another where she would always be slightly foreign, never fully Bavarian, never again purely Habsburg. Her marriage placed her between two worlds that mistrusted each other, while granting her ownership of neither. This was the first major fracture in Kunigunde's life, not a dramatic betrayal, not a visible collapse, but a slow realization that her marriage, meant to secure her position, had instead narrowed it further. She was bound to a husband whose political needs defined her worth, and tied to a dynasty that had surrendered her reluctantly. The conflict surrounding her marriage did not fade with time. It settled, quietly, into the foundation of her life as duchess. And it would shape everything that followed. Kunigunde's arrival in Bavaria did not mark the beginning of belonging. It marked the beginning of vigilance. The Bavarian court she entered was not a neutral space waiting to receive her. It was a place already shaped by memory, by political disputes, inherited suspicions, and the quiet awareness that her marriage had never been fully welcomed. Kunigunde was not stepping into an empty role. She was stepping into a tension that predated her presence and would long outlive it. As Duchess of Bavaria, she resided primarily in Munich, a court that balanced ceremony with calculation. Every gesture was read. Every silence was noticed. For Kunigunde, this meant learning a new kind of restraint. Not the obedience of childhood, but the caution of someone whose very existence carried political meaning. She was watched, not aggressively, but attentively. Some courtiers saw her as a conduit to imperial favor. Others viewed her as a reminder of Habsburg interference, a symbol of influence that might one day press too hard upon Bavarian autonomy. Kunigunde did not need to be outspoken to provoke reaction. Her lineage alone was enough. In such an environment, visibility became dangerous. The safest position was not prominence, but irreproachability. Kunigunde adapted quickly. She fulfilled ceremonial duties with precision. She appeared when required, hosted when expected, and withdrew when presence was no longer necessary. She did not attempt to dominate court life or reshape its customs. Instead, she learned the rhythms of a place where influence flowed quietly, often invisibly, and rarely through women. Her marriage did not grant her authority and governance. Decisions remained firmly in the hands of her husband and his advisors. Kunigunde was not consulted on matters of policy or territorial management. Even her imperial background did not elevate her voice. If anything, it encouraged further distance, an unspoken agreement that her involvement should remain symbolic, not substantive. This exclusion was not hostile. It was structural. The court's expectations of her were narrow but heavy. She was to embody stability. She was to soften the image of rule without shaping it. She was to produce heirs who would secure continuity. Everything else, opinion, ambition, dissatisfaction, was irrelevant. Kunigunde understood this implicitly. Years of preparation had taught her how to exist within confined roles without openly resisting them. But understanding did not eliminate the cost. Bavaria was not her home in the emotional sense. It was a place of residence, duty, and function. Her identity was fragmented, no longer fully Habsburg, never entirely Bavarian. She occupied a space in between, where loyalty was assumed but never tested, and belonging was conditional. Court life reinforced this isolation. Relationships were formal, careful, shaped by hierarchy rather than intimacy. Kunigunde's rank placed her above most, yet that elevation created distance rather than connection. True companionship was rare, and trust rarer still. Every alliance carried potential consequence. What she did possess, however, was patience. Kunigunde learned to measure time not in moments of fulfillment, but in endurance. Days were structured by ritual, weeks by religious observance, years by pregnancies and expectations. This rhythm offered a kind of stability, even as it slowly narrowed her world. Her emotional life, largely invisible to history, likely contracted inward. There was no space for complaint, no audience for vulnerability. The court valued composure above all else, and Kunigunde delivered it consistently. If she felt disappointment, it was expressed through silence. If she felt loneliness, it was absorbed privately. If she questioned her purpose, those questions left no record. Yet this quiet existence was not empty. It was purposeful in the way survival often is. Kunigunde's value at court lay in continuity. She represented legitimacy. Her presence affirmed alliances. Her future children would embody the union between dynasties. In this sense, she was successful. She did not disrupt. She did not provoke scandal. She did not weaken her husband's authority. But success, defined this way, carried an emotional cost that could not be measured at court. The absence of agency did not manifest as rebellion. It manifested as narrowing. Kunigunde's world became smaller, more focused, more internal. She was no longer a daughter awaiting marriage, nor a bride navigating transition. She had become something quieter, a figure whose role was to persist rather than progress. This persistence was not passive. It required discipline. It required the constant regulation of expression, the careful balancing of presence and absence. It required living within an identity shaped almost entirely by others. Motherhood loomed increasingly large as the one domain where her presence would become indispensable. Not as a political actor, but as a vessel of continuity. In a court where her voice carried little weight, her body would carry the future. It was here, in this narrowing space, that Kunigunde's life as Duchess truly took form, not as a story of influence or ambition, but as a long preparation for loss she could not yet imagine. The court of Bavaria did not wound her openly. It simply offered her nothing to hold on to, except what she would soon lose. Motherhood was the one role that finally anchored Kunigunde of Habsburg within the Bavarian court. It was not authority that gave her purpose, nor influence that granted her security, but the promise of continuity carried in her own body. In a world that measured women by what they produced rather than who they were, children became her only unquestioned value. Kunigunde gave birth multiple times over the course of her marriage. 2 of her sons would survive into adulthood and shape the future of Bavaria: William IV of Bavaria and Louis X of Bavaria. Their survival secured the dynasty. Their existence justified her marriage. In the eyes of history, this alone might seem like fulfillment. But the records do not end there. At least 2 of Kunigunde's children died in infancy or early childhood. Their names, like those of so many royal children lost young, barely appear in chronicles. They left no political footprint, no succession crisis, no reason for historians to linger. Yet for Kunigunde, these deaths were not abstract statistics. They were the quiet erasures of lives she had carried, named, and mourned. Child mortality in the late 15th century was common, even among the nobility. Disease, infection, and complications of birth spared no rank. Courts were accustomed to loss. Funerals were conducted with solemn efficiency. Life moved on. But what courts accepted as routine did not feel routine to mothers. There is no surviving letter in which Kunigunde describes her grief. No diary entry records her despair. Yet absence itself becomes a kind of evidence. Women like Kunigunde were not encouraged to document sorrow. Grief, especially maternal grief, was expected to be borne quietly, absorbed into prayer, expressed through piety, and then set aside in service of duty. Kunigunde had been raised to endure. Now endurance was demanded at its most personal level. Each pregnancy carried hope and fear in equal measure. Survival was never guaranteed. With each birth, the court watched not for the child's first breath, but for signs of viability, strength, health, endurance. Only then would celebration begin. Until that moment, joy was provisional. For Kunigunde, attachment was unavoidable. Motherhood was not ceremonial for her. Contemporary accounts suggest she was deeply invested in her children's lives, attentive and present in a way that exceeded mere obligation. This made loss sharper, not softer. When a child died, the court absorbed the blow and redirected attention toward the next pregnancy, the next heir, the next future. Kunigunde did not have that luxury. Her grief accumulated. It did not pass cleanly from one event to the next. It layered. What she lost was not only children, but a sense of safety and continuity itself. Each death carried a message that no effort, no piety, no obedience could guarantee protection. The one role she had been allowed to inhabit fully, motherhood, revealed itself as fragile and cruelly conditional. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Kunigunde had already been stripped of choice in youth, of agency in marriage, of belonging at court. Motherhood had offered her something different: intimacy, purpose, emotional grounding. Losing children threatened even that final refuge. Yet she did not collapse outwardly. She continued to fulfill her duties. She continued to appear composed. She continued to bear children because that was what was required of her. The court saw resilience. History recorded functionality. But something within her shifted. The losses did not turn Kunigunde toward ambition or control. They turned her inward. Power, which had never been hers to wield, now seemed irrelevant. Legacy, once defined by heirs, became hollow in the face of unpredictability. Survival itself began to feel temporary rather than cumulative. Religion deepened its hold on her life during this period, not as performance, but as refuge. Faith offered an explanation where politics offered none. Loss became divine will rather than failure. Suffering became meaningful rather than arbitrary. In prayer, Kunigunde could grieve without being observed. This inward turn did not distance her from her surviving children, but it changed the texture of her attachment. Love was now shadowed by fear. Every illness carried dread. Every absence felt dangerous. To love fully was to risk devastation again. And yet, she continued to love. Kunigunde's motherhood was not erased by loss. It was reshaped by it. She became quieter, more restrained, less invested in courtly display. Her presence remained constant, but her emotional horizon narrowed. Where others saw a duchess fulfilling her role successfully, she experienced motherhood as a space marked by both meaning and threat. By the time her surviving sons approached adulthood, Kunigunde had already learned a devastating truth. Fulfilling one's role did not protect what mattered most. Duty did not guarantee preservation. Obedience did not prevent loss. These lessons did not provoke rebellion. They prepared her for withdrawal. The woman who would later choose silence, simplicity, and disappearance was formed here. At the cradle and the grave, in moments unrecorded by power, where history turned away, but her life did not. Motherhood gave Kunigunde purpose. Loss taught her how easily purpose could be taken away. Grief did not arrive in Kunigunde's life as a single, shattering moment. It came in stages, quiet, cumulative, and unannounced. Each loss did not replace the one before it. It settled beside it. And over time, grief ceased to be an event and became a condition. In the world Kunigunde inhabited, sorrow was expected to be managed, not expressed. The court allowed mourning, but only briefly. Black garments were worn, prayers were said, ceremonies completed. Then attention shifted forward, as if continuity itself demanded emotional amnesia. For rulers and courtiers alike, grief was a delay, never a destination. For Kunigunde, however, grief became directional. It did not pull her backward into despair, nor push her forward into ambition. It turned her inward. After the deaths of her children, those close to her noticed a subtle but unmistakable change. She appeared less frequently at courtly gatherings. Her presence grew quieter, her movements more restrained. She fulfilled obligations, but without enthusiasm. The careful choreography of appearances remained intact, yet something essential had withdrawn from view. This was not depression in the modern sense. There is no evidence of incapacity or collapse. Kunigunde continued to function, to manage her household, to attend religious observance, to oversee her children's upbringing. But her internal orientation shifted. She no longer invested herself emotionally in the court's rhythms. Power did not attract her. Influence no longer tempted her. What grief took from her was not strength, but appetite. The ambitions that might have arisen from her position, shaping her sons' futures, asserting maternal authority, cultivating alliances, lost their urgency. Kunigunde had learned, through loss, how fragile outcomes were. Legacy no longer felt secure. Achievement no longer felt permanent. The world she had been trained to serve had revealed its indifference to devotion. Instead of responding with resistance, Kunigunde responded with detachment. This detachment was often misread as piety alone. Certainly, her religious devotion deepened during this period. Prayer became more frequent, more private. Her interest in charitable works expanded. She sought spaces of silence within the noise of court life. But faith was not merely spiritual consolation. It was also an emotional boundary. Religion allowed Kunigunde to step back without openly rejecting her role. It offered a sanctioned way to retreat, one that could not be criticized without appearing impious. In prayer, she could grieve without explanation. In humility, she could relinquish expectations without appearing ungrateful. Grief also altered her relationship to time. Where others measured time by progress, marriages arranged, alliances formed, heirs secured, Kunigunde began to experience time as erosion. Each year felt less like accumulation and more like subtraction. What had been lost did not return. What remained felt increasingly provisional. This perception changed how she related to her surviving children. Love did not diminish, but it grew cautious. Attachment was layered with fear. The instinct to protect intensified, yet protection felt increasingly symbolic rather than effective. She had learned that even the most sheltered lives could be taken without warning. Kunigunde did not become cold. She became careful. The court did not notice this transformation immediately. From the outside, she remained an ideal duchess, dutiful, modest, devout. There were no scandals, no conflicts, no visible signs of instability. This made her withdrawal easy to overlook. It did not disrupt power. It did not challenge order. But inwardly, Kunigunde had already begun to step away from the identity the court valued. She no longer saw herself primarily as a political instrument or even as a dynastic mother. Those roles had exacted too high a cost. Instead, she began to conceive of herself as a moral being whose worth was not contingent on outcomes. This was a radical internal shift in a world that defined women almost exclusively by what they produced and preserved. Grief had taught her something that privilege never could. That fulfillment within power structures was temporary and often illusory. The more she recognized this, the less she invested in maintaining appearances beyond necessity. She chose simplicity where possible. She limited emotional exposure. She cultivated habits that did not depend on recognition or reward. This inward turn did not isolate her completely, but it narrowed her emotional field. Kunigunde became less accessible, less reactive, less visible. Not because she rejected others, but because she no longer expected the world to protect what she loved. In this way, grief did not destroy Kunigunde's life. It redirected it. By the time she approached her 40s, she was already practicing a kind of withdrawal. Long before widowhood made it visible, she was still present, still married, still mother to future rulers. But the center of her life had shifted away from the court and toward something quieter, more contained. This was not resignation. It was preparation. Grief had not emptied her. It had stripped away everything she no longer believed in, and what remained would soon be tested again. In 1508, the structure that had defined Kunigunde's adult life collapsed quietly. Her husband, Albert IV of Bavaria, died after more than 2 decades of rule. There was no sudden scandal, no dramatic downfall, only the abrupt removal of the figure around whom her role as duchess had been organized. With his death, Kunigunde became a widow at 43, an age at which many noble women were expected to become politically sharper, not quieter. Widowhood, in late medieval Europe, was often a moment of transition into influence. Freed from marital obedience, high-ranking women could act as regents, advisors, or power brokers for their sons. Many seized this moment. They negotiated, governed, maneuvered. The court often expected it. Kunigunde did not. From the outside, her position was unusually strong. She was the daughter of an emperor. She was the mother of adult heirs, She was respected, experienced, and untainted by scandal. If she had wished to assert herself, to guide her son's rule, to shape Bavarian policy, to act as a stabilizing authority, no one could have easily stopped her. But the woman who reached widowhood in 1508 was not the woman who had entered marriage in 1487. By the time Albert died, Kunigunde had already been hollowed by loss. The deaths of children had taught her how little control position afforded. Grief had already loosened her attachment to power. Widowhood did not initiate withdrawal, it completed it. Albert's death removed the final personal bond tying her to secular authority. She was no longer a wife fulfilling dynastic duty through marriage. Her sons were grown, no longer dependent on her daily guidance. The structure that justified her constant presence at court, supporting a ruling husband, producing heirs, was gone. What remained was choice. And Kunigunde's response revealed how profoundly her inner life had shifted. She did not step forward. She stepped back. The days following Albert's death were marked by formal mourning, as custom required. Yet even in grief, Kunigunde's composure stood out, not because it was cold, but because it was resolved. Those close to her sensed not hesitation, but finality. There was no scramble to secure influence, no attempt to reposition herself within the new order. She did not argue for authority. She did not negotiate for control. She had already decided, perhaps long before, that she did not wish to remain. Widowhood clarified something Kunigunde had been learning for years. The world of power did not replenish what it consumed. It demanded loyalty, endurance, sacrifice. But it did not protect meaning. Everything she had loved within that structure had been taken. There was no incentive left to stay. Her sons, now rulers in their own right, did not need her in the way she once needed them. Her maternal role, though enduring emotionally, no longer defined her function. The court could proceed without her presence. And so she allowed it to. Kunigunde's withdrawal was not dramatic. There was no declaration, no rejection of her past. She simply reduced her participation. Appearances became rarer. Decisions passed around her rather than through her. She began to exist at the edges of a world she once embodied. This restraint puzzled some contemporaries. It confounded expectations shaped by ambition and lineage. But to Kunigunde, it felt natural. She had learned, through repeated loss, that presence did not equal protection, that influence did not equal preservation, that survival within power structures often meant surrendering what mattered most. Widowhood did not awaken bitterness in her. It clarified boundaries. The grief she felt for Albert was real, but it was quieter than earlier losses, not because it hurt less, but because it confirmed what she already knew. Attachment within this world was always temporary. Even companionship dissolved. Even stability vanished. What made Albert's death decisive was not only love lost, but context removed. With him gone, Kunigunde's life within the secular hierarchy lost its internal logic. She was no longer performing a role that felt necessary or meaningful. Remaining would have meant maintaining appearances without purpose. So she chose another path. This choice was not impulsive. It was the result of years of internal retreat. Widowhood did not force her hand, it freed it. In stepping away from influence, Kunigunde was not rejecting responsibility. She was rejecting illusion. She had fulfilled every obligation expected of her: daughter, wife, mother, duchess. The world had taken its due. Now she claimed the one thing she had never been granted before: the right to decide how she would live what remained of her life. And that decision would soon remove her from the world of power altogether. Not as an exile, not as a failure, but as someone who no longer belonged there. Widowhood closed the last chapter of Kunigunde's public life. What followed would be quieter, and finally, entirely her own. After widowhood, Kunigunde of Habsburg entered a space that few women of her rank ever truly occupied: the space of possibility. For the first time in her life, her future was not dictated by a father, a husband, or the immediate demands of dynastic survival. The court expected her to act. History anticipated a continuation: regency, council, quiet power exercised through sons. All the tools were available to her. She declined them all. This refusal was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of recognition. Kunigunde understood something that courts often refuse to acknowledge. Influence does not always heal loss. Authority does not restore meaning. Power can keep one visible, but it cannot make life whole again. She had spent decades living at the center of structures that promised permanence and delivered fragility. Now that those structures no longer required her presence, she saw no reason to remain. Her sons, William IV and Louis X, were adults, capable rulers with their own advisors, ambitions, and courts. They respected their mother, but they did not depend on her. Kunigunde could have shaped their reigns from behind the scenes, but doing so would have meant re-entering a world she had already outgrown. The court watched her closely in the months following Albert's death, not because she caused disruption, but because her silence was unexpected. She attended necessary ceremonies, observed mourning customs, and fulfilled transitional obligations, but she did not linger. She did not assert maternal authority over governance. She did not position herself as a stabilizing force. Her restraint unsettled those who equated visibility with relevance. Yet Kunigunde's withdrawal was not a retreat born of fear or exhaustion. It was a deliberate narrowing of life to what still felt true. She had learned, through repeated loss, that attachment to outcomes only magnified pain. Remaining at court would have meant continuing to invest emotionally in structures she no longer trusted to sustain what she loved. Instead, she chose to step aside before bitterness could take root. This choice required unusual clarity. In a society where women's worth was tied to their usefulness within power hierarchies, withdrawing voluntarily risked invisibility. Kunigunde accepted that cost. She did not seek to redefine herself publicly. She sought to preserve what remained of her inner coherence. Her days became quieter. She spent more time in private devotion, less in ceremonial display. She limited her engagements, declined invitations that served no purpose beyond appearance, and allowed others to occupy the center she once held. This gradual disappearance was neither dramatic nor controversial. It unfolded gently, as if she were easing herself out of a role that had already ended. Some interpreted her behavior as excessive piety. Others saw resignation. Few recognized it as autonomy. For Kunigunde, withdrawal was not absence, it was alignment. The court had taught her how to endure. Grief had taught her how to detach. Widowhood gave her permission to act on what she already knew. She did not hate the world she left behind. She did not condemn it. But she no longer believed it could offer her anything essential. The world of power had taken her youth, her choices, her children, and her companion. It had rewarded her with status, but status felt weightless beside what she had lost. Remaining would have meant continuing a performance whose meaning had expired. By choosing withdrawal over influence, Kunigunde disrupted an unspoken expectation that noble women should translate suffering into authority, grief into leverage. She refused to turn pain into currency. She refused to remain legible to a system that had never truly seen her. This refusal was quiet, but it was complete. She did not disappear overnight. There was no symbolic renunciation, no public gesture announcing a new identity. She simply allowed distance to grow. Over time, her presence at court became optional rather than essential. Her voice became advisory rather than directive. Eventually, even advisory roles fell away. What replaced them was not emptiness, but simplicity. Kunigunde's life narrowed to practices that did not depend on recognition: prayer, charity, contemplation. These were not escapes. They were choices shaped by long experience. In silence, she found a form of stability that power had never provided. In humility, she found a freedom that rank had denied her. This stage of her life often goes unnoticed because it lacks drama. There are no conflicts to narrate, no decisions that altered borders or treaties. Yet it was here that Kunigunde exercised the most agency she had ever known. She chose not to compete. She chose not to control. She chose not to remain. In doing so, she redefined success on her own terms, not as endurance within power, but as withdrawal from it without resentment. This was the threshold moment, the final turning inward before a definitive departure. The world she had served so faithfully receded, not because it expelled her, but because she no longer answered its call. What followed would make that choice irreversible. And for the first time in her life, that irreversibility belonged to her alone. Kunigunde's withdrawal from court did not end in obscurity. It ended in intention. After years of gradual retreat, she made a final, irreversible decision. She entered the convent of the Poor Clares in Munich. This was not a temporary devotion, nor a symbolic gesture meant to inspire admiration. It was a severing. The last formal separation between her and the world she had served all her life. For someone of Kunigunde's rank, this choice was striking. Many widowed noblewomen supported religious institutions from a distance. They endowed convents, funded chapels, adopted pious routines while retaining status and comfort. Kunigunde did something rarer. She stepped inside. She relinquished not only influence, but identity. The transition was deliberate and complete. She exchanged court dress for woolen habit. Titles that had followed her since birth were replaced by a rule of silence. Her days were no longer shaped by ceremony or expectation, but by prayer, work, and routine humility. The rhythms of power, news, alliances, decisions ceased to matter. To the outside world, it may have appeared as disappearance. To Kunigunde, it was arrival. The Poor Clares followed a life of radical simplicity. Their devotion emphasized poverty, restraint, and withdrawal from worldly attachment. For Kunigunde, whose entire existence had been defined by attachment imposed from without, dynasty, marriage, succession, this way of life offered something profoundly unfamiliar. A space where nothing was demanded of her. No heirs, no alliances, no performance. Her choice puzzled some contemporaries. Why would a woman of such lineage choose obscurity when she still commanded respect? Why step away when she could still shape events indirectly? The answer lies not in rejection, but in exhaustion of meaning. Kunigunde had learned that influence required constant negotiation with forces she could not trust. That visibility invited expectation. That attachment, no matter how carefully managed, ended in loss. The convent offered something the court never had: limits. a life circumscribed not by ambition, but by intention. Within those walls, Kunigunde was no longer a duchess navigating suspicion, nor a widow balancing expectation. She was simply a woman practicing faith. Her past did not vanish, but it ceased to define her daily worth. Accounts from the period suggest that she did not enter the convent out of bitterness or despair. She did not flee the world because she despised it. She left because she no longer belonged to it. The world of power had taken all it could. What remained of her life needed a different context. In the convent, grief did not need to be managed. Silence allowed sorrow to exist without explanation. Loss did not have to be transformed into endurance or usefulness. It could simply be carried. Kunigunde's devotion was quiet, steady, and unremarkable in the best sense. She did not seek prominence even within religious life. There were no reports of dramatic asceticism, no stories of exceptional authority among the sisters. She lived as one among many, deliberately erasing the hierarchy that had defined her existence for decades. This erasure was not self-punishment, it was relief. For the first time, Kunigunde's value was not tied to outcome. Prayer did not produce heirs. Charity did not secure alliances. Obedience did not preserve bloodlines. The measures of success were internal, invisible, and unrecorded. And that invisibility mattered. In stepping away from history's gaze, Kunigunde reclaimed something she had never possessed: privacy of meaning. The convent protected her from the narrative demands of power. No one expected her life to signify anything beyond faithfulness. Her days followed a narrow but stable path: work, prayer, silence, care for the poor. These acts did not change borders or dynasties, but they restored proportion. Suffering was no longer exceptional. It was human, shared, ordinary. This was where her long inward journey found its physical form. The court had required composure. Motherhood had required endurance. Widowhood had required restraint. The convent required only presence. Kunigunde's choice did not erase her past, but it placed it at a distance where it could no longer wound her daily life. The losses she had carried, children, husband, belonging, did not vanish. They settled into memory rather than action. In this sense, the convent was not an escape from grief. It was a place where grief no longer dictated direction. History often struggles with such endings. There is no climax, no resolution in the conventional sense. A woman born into power walks into silence and is content there. Nothing collapses. Nothing triumphs. But for Kunigunde, this was the first life she had chosen fully. The silence of the convent was not empty. It was spacious enough to hold everything she had lost, without demanding that she lose herself again. When Kunigunde of Habsburg died on August 6, 1520, the world did not pause. There was no imperial procession. No dynastic announcement echoed across courts. No public reckoning of what had been lost. She died quietly, at 55, within the walls of the convent she had chosen, far from the ceremonial spaces that had once defined her life. For a woman born at the heart of European power, her death passed almost unnoticed by the machinery of history. This absence was not accidental. It was the final consequence of a life spent stepping away. Kunigunde had already removed herself from the structures that would have transformed her death into spectacle. She was no longer a duchess in residence, no longer a political figure whose passing required response. She was a nun, living under a rule that valued humility over remembrance. In choosing that life, she had also chosen the manner of her end. The contrast is stark. Had she died decades earlier, while still a wife, a mother of heirs, a visible presence at court. Her death would have demanded ritual. Chroniclers would have recorded it. Mourning would have been performed publicly. Her lineage would have mattered. But by 1520, Kunigunde's identity had been deliberately simplified. She had traded titles for anonymity, influence for silence, narrative for prayer. And so her death followed the logic of her final years, unadorned, unremarked, complete. This kind of ending often confuses historical memory. We expect importance to culminate in ceremony, tragedy to erupt in spectacle. Kunigunde offered neither. Her life did not crescendo, it faded. Yet that fading was not erasure. It was fulfillment of a different kind. Those who knew her in the convent remembered her not as a former duchess, but as a woman of discipline and restraint. She did not speak of her past unless asked. She did not assert rank. She did not claim exceptional status. Her authority, if it could be called that, came from consistency, not command. In death, she was mourned as she had lived there, quietly. No grand tomb preserved her story. No monument insisted on her relevance. The institutions of power that once defined her value did not rush to claim her memory. They had already moved on. To new alliances, new heirs, new concerns. And perhaps this was exactly what Kunigunde wanted. Her death did not represent abandonment by history. It represented release from it. She had spent her life fulfilling obligations she did not choose. Daughter, bride, duchess, mother. Each role had demanded sacrifice. Each had taken something irreplaceable. By the time she reached the end, she had nothing left to offer that world and no desire to be claimed by it. The simplicity of her death stands as a quiet rebuke to dynastic logic. It suggests that meaning does not always align with visibility, that a life can be complete without leaving a mark proportional to its origin. Kunigunde's final years had stripped her identity down to essentials. And so, when death came, there was no remainder to reconcile. No unfinished ambition, no unresolved struggle for power, no need to be remembered as anything more than what she had become. In the language of courts, her end would be called insignificant. In the language of faith, it would be called peaceful. In the language of her life, it was coherent. History rarely knows what to do with such coherence. Chroniclers prefer rupture, violent deaths, scandal, downfall. Kunigunde offered continuity. Her death mirrored her withdrawal. Gradual, intentional, unclaimed. She did not fall from power. She stepped away from it until there was nothing left to fall from. This does not make her life smaller. It makes it sharper. Her death forces a question that history often avoids. What happens to those who fulfill every expectation and then refuse to remain visible once their usefulness ends? Kunigunde answered that question by choosing obscurity over struggle. She did not cling to memory. She did not demand acknowledgement. She did not insist on meaning imposed from outside. The silence that followed her death was not neglect. It was alignment with a life that had long since turned inward. In this way, Kunigunde's end was not tragic in the conventional sense. There was no injustice, no betrayal, no sudden collapse. What made it tragic, if tragedy is the right word, was its completeness. Everything she had once been had been given up willingly, piece by piece, until nothing remained that required defense. Her children lived on. Her dynasty continued. The world did not stop. But the woman who had borne that world's weight left it without disturbance. And perhaps that is why her story lingers quietly rather than loudly. Not because it demands attention, but because it resists it. Kunigunde of Habsburg did not die forgotten. She died finished. Kunigunde of Habsburg did not fall from power. She stepped away from it. She was born into one of Europe's greatest dynasties, fulfilled every role demanded of her, and endured losses that would have broken louder lives. Children were buried. A husband was taken. A world that once defined her worth emptied itself of meaning. And when there was nothing left to hold on to, she did not fight the silence. She chose it. Her life was not a story of rebellion or defeat, but of completion. She gave the world everything it asked for, and then refused to give it more. In the end, her quiet withdrawal was not disappearance, but agency finally claimed. History did not cast Kunigunde aside. It simply no longer needed her, and she, at last, no longer needed it.